Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Sommer Sanchez and this channel is all about true crime, cults, and something I call heinous history, which are just really old crime cases that I find fascinating. And in honor of Halloween for the entire month of October, all of my uploads will be centered around cases that I find extra creepy. So if any of that sounds like something that might interest you, please consider subscribing to my channel. Today I have a truly messed up, disturbing case for you. I honestly can't believe that this even actually happened. It sounds made up. It honestly sounds like some weird plot from like a A24 movie or something. I lost sleep over this case whenever I was researching it. It's so messed up. It's so disturbing. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't know, just the stuff that happens in this case just really freak me out. Today, I'm going to tell you about the Alexander family murders. And this case actually does involve a cult, and it's not like one of my normal cult cases that I do. Almost all of the bad stuff that happens doesn't really involve the cult itself. It's only centered around the leaders, and none of the cult members are actually involved at all. I don't even know if you can class it as a cult. I mean, I guess you could. There are definitely some culty things that happen in this group. They call themselves a society. I don't know. I guess they're a cult, but it feels weird to say this. But in this case, the cult is like the least of our worries. And like I said, this is a super disturbing, very graphic case. So I do want to give a huge content warning. I'm going to be talking about some really messed up stuff. So if you don't want to listen to anything like that right now, you might want to skip this video. It's going to be pretty intense at parts, especially towards the end. Now, grab a coffee or a snack or both. Today I'm just having one of these Starbucks caramel frappuccino things because I didn't have time to go to the coffee shop. And sit back, relax, and let's talk about the Alexander family murders. We are starting today's case in Hamburg, Germany in the early 1950s. A man named George Rill was the leader of a religious group called the Lorber Society. And this group was mostly rooted in Christian ideals, but just on the way extreme end of Christian. Just a very brief history of how the Lorber Society even started. And I'm really sorry if no one else is interested in these little historical facts that I try to give. I love history. I love lore. I like all that kind of stuff. I love to hear the background of things and how they got started. So I always try to add a little bit of that into my videos when I can. But if you're not interested in that, I totally get it. Just skip ahead maybe 2 minutes. In the year 1840, there was a man named Jacob Lorber, and he was 40 years old. He was a musician, and he was also described as a seer and a Christian mystic of the time. He was also a deeply religious man. And Jacob lived near the area of Austria at this point. So like I said, Jacob was about 40 years old at this point in 1840. And around this time, he starts hearing a voice. And he would describe this voice as sounding like it was coming from the vicinity of his heart. Now, this voice kept talking and wouldn't stop. So Jacob decided that he was going to start writing down what this voice was telling him. And eventually the voice revealed itself as belonging to Jesus. And Jacob seemingly believed that this voice truly was the voice of Jesus. And like I said, he just started writing down everything that this voice was telling him. A lot of the writings talked about extreme self-denial in order to gain God's favor. And of course, I haven't read these writings. I'm just going based off of what I've researched. But anyways, Jacob ends up dying in 1864. And after he dies, someone finds these writings and they end up having them published. And after the writings were published, they actually gained quite a bit of attention from the religious community. And eventually there was this little following that was created based off of these writings of Jacob Lorber. And the name of this following was the New Salem Society. And they called themselves the New Salem Society because New Salem was the name of the publishing company that had published Jacob Lorber's writings. So this little following actually grew, and they were actually active between the years of 1921 and 1937. But eventually the Nazis found out about the society and they ended up forcing them to disband. But once World War II II was over, the society actually got back together and they reformed, but this time they called themselves the Lorber Society. So yeah, that was just a super brief history of how the Lorber Society even started. So now we're back in Hamburg, Germany. It's the early 1950s, and like I said, there's this man named George Rill who is the leader of the Lorber Society. This group basically worshipped 24/7. That's pretty much all they did. Most of their beliefs were rooted in Christianity, but just to the extreme. Lots of extreme self-denial. Don't really know the details behind this. Like, I don't know what they mean by extreme. I don't have any examples. I just read that they were into extreme self-denial. They also believed that outsiders were impure and they were evil. So like if you didn't believe like they did, you were evil. Those kind of things definitely seem culty to me. So that's why I'm inclined to say that this is a cult, even though some sources don't class them as that. Sometime in the 1950s, the active leader George Rill ends up meeting a man named Harold Alexander, and he introduces Harold to the society and all their beliefs, and Harold was very open to everything that George was telling him about the society. He was attracted to this immediately. And Harold actually really likes George too. Like he takes an instant liking to him and they become fast friends because George also takes a quick liking to Harold. They just kind of clicked when they met. And Harold Alexander is married and his wife's name is Drogma. Harold goes home and he tells Drogma all about this guy George that he met, and he's telling him all about all of his beliefs and how awesome he thinks this guy is. And Harold tells Drogma that he wants to join the society. And Drogma's all on board. She's like, yeah, sure, let's do it. I'm with you. It definitely seemed like whatever Harold said goes. Like he called all the shots in this relationship. At least that's the impression that I got. So Harold and Drogma join the society and they throw themselves completely into it. They started to distance themselves from the rest of the world like the society had because they thought everyone else was evil. So Harold and Drogma did the same thing. And as time went on, Harold does become closer and closer with George Rill. But not long after Harold and Drogma joined the Lorber Society, George actually fell ill, and I'm not really sure what George was sick with. I tried to find out, but whatever it was acting quickly, and George knew that he didn't have much time left. So this next part is actually based off of what Harold says, so who knows if this is actually true, but according to Harold, as George is basically dying, he calls Harold over to his deathbed and he tells Harold that he wants him to take over as the next leader of the Lorber Society. And Harold very happily agreed to do this, and then he leaves the room and he tells everybody there that he's going to be taking over as the next leader. Everybody reportedly was okay with this. They were fine with it as long as it was what George wanted. Harold and Drogma had not been a part of the society for very long at all, so I don't know, it just seems a little weird. Like I wonder if anyone kind of questioned this at all, like maybe thought Harold was making this up or something. I don't know, but either way, Harold ends up taking over once George does pass away, and he's now the new acting leader of the Lorber Society. So once George passed away and Harold took over, at first things were pretty much the same. Harold was kind of sticking with the same stuff that George had been talking about before he passed away. But then eventually Harold started adding in his own beliefs to it. He started telling everyone that there was a prophet that was going to be coming to them, and this would be the next prophet of God. And he didn't know who this person was, but that as soon as he laid eyes on this person, he would instinctively know that this was the prophet. He also tells them that once the prophet does show up, that the society is expected to do whatever the prophet wants, no matter how weird or crazy or messed up it is. They were expected to follow whatever the prophet said without question. So again, this is another reason why I'm inclined to say that this is a cult. So over time, Harold just keeps talking about this coming prophet, and he's just drilling it into the society members' heads that they are to follow whatever the prophet says without question. And then of course, eventually over time, these people become completely brainwashed to think that the prophet is coming and that they are to follow whatever this person tells them to do. So now they're just waiting on this prophet to show up. Now, after a couple of years of leadership, Harold and Drogma end up having a child, and this is actually their second child. They already have a daughter named Marina, and now they actually have their first son, and they name him Frank. And instantly, when Harold laid eyes on Frank, he knew that this was the prophet that they had all been waiting for. And so he tells everyone in the society that the prophet is finally here. And it's always so hard to tell if these cult leaders actually believe some of the things that they preach. Like, does he really think that his son is the next prophet? Just as they promised, the society members embrace Frank as their prophet, and they devote themselves to basically serving Frank no matter what Frank wants. And Harold and Drogma actually go on to have 2 more children after they have Frank. They end up having a set of twin girls who they name Petra and Sabine. And I should probably mention, because it might start to get a little confusing as we go on, the Lorber Society members don't live together. As far as I know, they all had their own homes that they went to. I know for sure that Harold and Drogma and their children don't live with anyone. They live by themselves in their own place. And I'm assuming that all the other members did as well. That's what's so frustrating about this case, is I don't know a ton about the society members, because the horrible things that happen in this case, like I said, don't really involve the cult. It doesn't involve the society really. It's all centered around Harold and his family. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I hate that. I really like to give you guys all the information and all the backstory and all that stuff. Some of these cases, it's just really hard to do that, and this is just one of those cases. So just to recap, so we're all on the same page, we have Harold Alexander, who is the acting leader of the Lorber Society at this point. His wife, Drogma. They have a daughter named Marina. Then they have their second child, Frank, who is considered by everyone in the society and everyone in his family to be the next prophet of God. Then we have twin girls, Petra and Sabine. So since Frank is considered to be the next prophet of God, as you can imagine, he is weighted on hand and foot. He doesn't want for anything. Everyone worships him. And you could imagine how this would give a child a really warped sense of reality. Everyone catered to Frank from the time he was born. So he grew up thinking that this was normal. And he also grew up thinking that he truly was a prophet. He had been told ever since birth that he was the chosen one. And when I say everyone worshiped Frank, I truly mean everyone, including his family members, like his mother, his sisters, his father. Everybody worshipped Frank. Everyone did what Frank said, which is just so weird to think about. Like, could you imagine one of your children calling all the shots from birth, basically? And like I said earlier, the Lorber Society believed that outsiders were impure and they were evil. So any interactions that they had with anyone who was outside of their society, it was extremely limited. I'm sure they all had to make a living, so I'm assuming they had jobs and stuff. So I'm thinking that that was mainly the only place where they interacted with people that were outside of their society. But you know what I mean? Like, they only ever spent like personal time with other members of the Lorber Society. So if that's the case, then Frank is literally surrounded by nothing but people who worship him. Everyone's world revolved around Frank since the day he was born, and he grew into an entitled brat. But things would get so much darker once Frank started moving into his teenage years. So once Frank entered his teenage years, he started to become interested in girls, and he started to really become interested in sex. But the problem was, Frank had always been taught that outsiders were impure. So he didn't want to dirty himself by trying to get with girls that were outside of the Lorber Society. And this is when Frank comes up with a truly gross idea. So Frank goes to Harold and he explains the whole thing to him, and he tells him his whole dilemma and tells him that he's having all these feelings and urges, but that he doesn't want to go outside of the society to look for anyone because he wants to keep his purity. And that's when Frank tells Harold that he thinks the best way to keep his purity intact and satisfy these urges is to start having relations with his mother and his sisters. Oh God. Harold thinks this idea is brilliant, and he is 100% on board with it. So then Frank starts a sexual relationship with his mother and his sisters. But that's not all. Harold decides that he's going to join in, and he occasionally will join in on the abuse while Frank is sleeping with his mother or his sisters. And we haven't talked too much about Drogma and the three sisters. I don't know a lot about them, honestly, but I can tell you that they were totally brainwashed at this point. They had all been conditioned to think that Frank is the prophet, that Harold is the leader of this society, and they just do what they're told. That's what it seems like to me. They are just there to obey whatever order Harold or Frank gave them. It doesn't surprise me that the daughters and Drogma seemingly were okay with this. I'm not saying that it's okay. I'm not saying that they even truly felt like it's okay. This was obviously sexual abuse. Like, let's not beat around the bush. That's what this is. The younger two daughters, Sabine and Petra, they were underage at this point. They couldn't have been more than like 14, maybe 15 years old when this started, because I'm pretty sure Frank was like 16 when this started. So they can't consent. Like, even if they were totally brainwashed and they truly felt like they were okay with this sexual relationship, they can't consent. And I highly doubt that Drogma wanted this relationship with her son. So all the women in the family just go along with this, and they just let Frank and sometimes Harold do whatever they want. So yeah, this is the new normal in the Alexander home. Frank is now having sex with his mother and his sisters, and occasionally his father Harold joins in. So this goes on for a while, and then one day, one of the sisters, and I don't know which one it was, I tried to find out, I think it was one of the younger two, one of the twins, either Petra or Sabine, was at school, and they were talking to one of their friends, and they were explaining how they had been feeling really jealous lately that their brother Frank had been paying attention to one of their sisters more than her. She was just getting super jealous that Frank was paying attention to the other sisters more. And the friend that was listening to this got really creeped out by what she was hearing. It sounded as if she was explaining like jealousy over a romantic relationship. And it just really creeped this girl out. And eventually it spread around the school that there was something weird going on in the Alexander home, and that there was potentially some incest going on. I think we all know how fast rumors travel in school, and that's exactly what happened here. And then eventually those rumors made their way all the way to the parents, and some of the parents started hearing about these rumors. And when that happened, the parents completely freaked out, and they went directly to the police to tell them what they had heard. And the police actually take this really seriously, and they decided they're going to launch an investigation into the Alexander family. But word of the investigation ends up making its way to Harold Alexander, and now he knows that the authorities are getting ready to really start looking into what's going on in his family, and he panics. And not only does Harold Alexander find out about the investigation, the Lorber Society members actually end up hearing about it as well. And the members of the society had actually started to question things themselves. They had started seeing some pretty concerning things. They were not into incest. That's not something that they practiced or preached. And they started seeing some weird things and kind of hearing some rumors. And they had already sort of started to try to distance themselves a little bit from Frank and from Harold. So Harold's in a full-blown panic right now, like I said. So he decides to call a meeting of the Lorber Society, and he tells everyone that he is actually going to be stepping down as leader and that they needed to find someone else to take his place. And of course, the Lorber Society members already knew something weird was going on, and they didn't want anything to do with Harold and his family really anymore. So they were like totally fine with this. And then just to distance themselves even more from this investigation, Harold decides that the family's just going to pack up and move. And not just a little move. They decide that they're just going to move to a whole new country. So Harold and his family end up fleeing to Spain, and they end up in Santa Cruz. And they end up finding this little apartment, and they all just kind of settle into this new city and settle into their new normal. And at this point, they had completely broken ties with the Lorber Society, but they were still calling Frank the prophet. Everything was still the same for Frank. Nothing really changed. They were just in a new location, and now their religious society just consisted of their immediate family members. But all the incest continued, all the sexual abuse, all of that continued. Nothing really changed for them. They had just broken ties with the society. But they did implement another really disturbing, messed up ritual into their beliefs. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. So like I said, they fell right back into those same messed up ways that they had in Germany. All the incest, all that stuff continued. And life went on like this for about a year. And then one day things just went completely off the rails. And this is when I do need to give that warning that things are about to get extremely graphic and really, really, really messed up. So on December 21st, 1970, Harold, Drogma, Marina, Petra, and Frank were all just in their apartment, just kind of hanging out. Drogma and Harold had actually moved into their bedroom and they were gonna go lay down to take a nap. So they were now in their room, both laying down on their bed. So Frank ends up walking into Harold and Drogma's room while they're laying down, and he goes and sits at the edge of their bed near his mother. Now, while Frank is sitting at the edge of the bed, he ends up looking down at his mother and he's just kind of staring at her. And Drogma feels Frank staring at her, so she kind of turns her head and catches his gaze, and she's now staring at him as well. Frank would later say that he perceived his mother's expression on her face to be suggestive, and it enraged him that she would look at him like that. And once this happened, Frank just stands up and he declares that the killing hour was upon them. And the killing hour is that thing that I mentioned earlier that had been implemented into the Alexander's belief system. So basically everyone in the Alexander household had agreed that if Frank ever declared that the killing hour was upon them, that would signal the women in the family that it was time for them to essentially be sacrificed. And it would happen right then and there as soon as Frank declared it. And the women in the family were to completely comply. They were not to try to fight back. They were to sit there and wait for Frank to kill them. Harold and Frank had basically come to believe that women were innately evil. And I don't know if this is something that the Lorber Society preached or not. I really couldn't find that information. As far as I know, this was something that Harold and Frank kind of started themselves whenever they left the Lorber Society. According to Frank, the only way for their souls to be saved is if they were killed in like a sacrificial kind of way, and then their souls would be released to heaven. And what happens is so messed up. So when Frank jumped up and declared that the killing hour was upon them, that then signaled to Drogma that she was to stop everything and just lay there and let her son kill her. And that's exactly what he did. Frank grabbed a wooden hanger and he began to relentlessly beat his mother with it. The first blow that he gave her kind of let her know that this was really happening. It's reported that Drogma actually felt this first hit and she turned over and laid on her back on the bed to make it easier for her son to kill her. Just think about that for a second. Just take a moment to think about what I just said. She knew that her son was about to kill her, and instead of fighting back, she turned over and laid down on her back to make it easier for him to accomplish this. And so Drogma just lays there and Frank continues to beat his mother with this wooden hanger. Now, while this is going on, remember, Harold had been laying in the bed right next to Drogma. And instead of having any sense or any like maybe regret and maybe wanting to stop his son from killing his wife, Harold just excitedly jumps up from the bed and he runs into the living room and he starts playing the organ. The organ thing makes this so much creepier to me. So all of the noise from the organ and from Drogma being beaten ends up alerting Marina, who, by the way, at this point is 18 years old, and Petra, who is 15. So they come out to see what the hell is going on. And they walk out to Frank relentlessly beating their mother, and they see it and they know exactly what's happening. And then Harold tells his daughter that the killing hour is upon them and that they needed to prepare themselves. The girls go and sit down in the living room and just wait for Frank to be done killing their mother so that he can come and kill them. This is the part that just really freaks me out. Like, it truly disturbs me to think about. It's insane. And just when I think I've heard it all, I hear something like this. and I cannot get it out of my head. But anyways, Frank gets done with Drogma, and at this point, it's unclear whether Drogma was completely dead or if she had just been beaten unconscious. She could have still been alive at this point. We don't know. But Frank ends up coming into the room where Petra and Marina were just sitting and waiting, and he pretty much just does the same thing to them. And he beats them both with the wooden hanger, and they both lose consciousness. And I just want to remind you, Harold is still playing the organ while all this is going on. Seriously, what the actual hell? So after the women had either died or lost consciousness, remember, we don't know for sure, they could have still been alive at this point, Frank then goes into the kitchen and gets a knife. And then he comes back and he begins to cut off the quote offending parts of each of the women. Now, Frank had already beaten his mother and two of his sisters, and now he is trying to cut off parts of their bodies, and he's starting to get tired. So he then tells his father that it's time for him to come and help while he plays the organ. So now Frank is on the organ and Harold is completing the task of cutting off the offending parts of each of these women. And in the end, they end up cutting the breasts off of each of the women and also their genitalia, and then they nail them to the wall. They also end up cutting out Drogma's heart, and then they wrapped it in some cable and then hung it from the wall. And I can't even imagine what this apartment must have looked like once all this was done. So after they finish all of that, they decide that they can't sleep in that apartment that night. They're gonna have to go somewhere else. So they end up deciding to go stay at another property that they owned, and they spend the night there. So the next morning on December 22nd, Harold and Frank wake up and they decide that they need to go talk to Sabine. Did you forget about Sabine? She's the other sister. She's one of the twins, and she was not there in the apartment when the killing hour happened. She was actually staying at a local doctor's house. She was working as a housekeeper there, and she had decided to just stay a couple of nights there to complete a job that she was working on. So Harold and Frank, they decide that they need to tell Sabine immediately what's happened. And so they decide that they're going to head over to this doctor's house. So this doctor's name was Dr. Trinkler. Pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. They get to his home and they knock on the door, and the doctor comes to the door. And when he gets there, he sees these two men covered in what he thinks is mud. They look completely disgusting, dirty, and he's really kind of creeped out by them. But they tell him that they are Sabine's father and brother, and so he doesn't want to be rude, so he ends up telling them, hold on just a second, I'll go get Sabine. And he keeps them kind of like in the front little area of his house where the front door is, and he goes and gets Sabine, and he tells her, your father and your brother are here to talk to you. So she comes down and she comes to the door and she greets her father and her brother. Now, Dr. Trinkler didn't want to be rude and seem like he was snooping on their conversation, so he kind of walks away where they can't see him. He's kind of out of sight. He's feeling really uneasy about these people, and they're in his home, so he wants to make sure everything's okay. So he kind of stays hidden, but he's listening to what they're saying. And that's when the doctor hears Harold say, "We wanted you to know that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." And then he hears Sabine calmly say, "I'm sure you've done what was necessary." And understandably, the doctor is freaking out at this point, so he goes straight to his phone and he goes and calls the police. And he's also realizing that what he thought was mud on these men was probably blood. And the police immediately head over to the doctor's house, and they show up and they start questioning Harold and Frank and Sabine. And they end up taking them down to the station for questioning. They don't try to hide anything. They tell the police everything that's happened, and they don't see anything wrong with it. In their minds, they had saved these women's souls. And because of them, Drogma and Marina and Petra were now in heaven. They told the police that the women were naturally unclean, and by murdering them the way they did, that was cleansing their souls and allowing them to enter heaven. How do you get there? How do you come to that conclusion? And of course, the police do not see it this way, and Frank and Harold are both arrested. The police end up going to the Alexander apartment. They were eventually going to have to face this crime scene, and it was a nightmare. There was blood everywhere, and I honestly cannot imagine what those police officers went through after they saw that crime scene. And I could just imagine all of them needing like serious therapy after seeing what they saw. So like I said, Harold and Frank were arrested, but before they could stand trial, Frank and Harold were sent to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and it was found that they were not fit to stand trial. Both men ended up being committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. And it's crazy, but Sabine actually begged the authorities to let her go to the asylum with her father and brother to live with them. And of course, they told her no, she couldn't do this. And I'm not 100% sure what happened to Sabine, but I have read that the authorities ended up sending her to a convent to live. And just one more super disturbing thing before we close out this case. In 1990, Harold and Frank Alexander managed to escape from the asylum, and they were never found. So I'm going to end here on that really creepy thought. And that was the case of the Alexander family murders. Very, very disturbing. I want to say just really quick, thank you so much to everyone that has recently subscribed to my channel. This whole thing is way out of my comfort zone. It means the world to me. I've gotten so many really supportive, sweet comments, and my subscriber count just keeps growing, and it's making me so, so happy. And I'm really thankful for each and every one of you that has shown me any amount of support. And I will have one more super creepy Halloween story time for you at the end of October. So if you don't want to subscribe, that's fine. Just come see me in like a week or two so you don't miss out on that content. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.